What if I were to tell you the most terrifying places on Earth aren't abandoned? What if they're still operating, with something hiding in plain sight? For decades, people walked into a dark carnival attraction, laughed, screamed, and walked away, never realizing there was something inside that shouldn't have been there, something that had been waiting in the darkness for decades. Until one ordinary night, someone finally discovered that what they were looking at wasn't what they thought. Tonight, we're not only going behind the lights, we are going to deep dive into one of the strangest and creepiest true stories ever to come out of a carnival. Because sometimes, the thing that scares you most is the thing you were never supposed to discover. Imagine walking into a funhouse late at night. The lights are dim, mirrors surround you. Machinery clicks somewhere behind the walls. A distorted voice comes through the speakers. You turn a corner, and there, beneath a wooden gallows, hangs the body of a man. His skin is dark and shriveled. His clothes are old. His face looks frozen in death. A noose hangs around his neck. You stare at him. Then you laugh nervously. Because it's a funhouse. It's supposed to be fake, a mannequin, a prop, something designed to scare you. But imagine reaching out, touching the arm, and watching it break off. Not like plastic, not like wax, but with the unmistakable sound of something real. Bone. That is exactly the nightmare that unfolded in California in 1976. The body hanging inside that funhouse wasn't a prop. It wasn't a special effect. It was a human corpse. And it had been dead for 65 years. His name was Elmer McCurdy. And what happened to his body after his death is one of the strangest and darkest stories in American history. McCurdy was born in 1880 and eventually became an outlaw in Oklahoma. He had served in the army and learned how to use explosives. After leaving the military, he turned those skills toward robbery. But McCurdy wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. In one train robbery, he expected thousands of dollars. Instead, he and his accomplices ended up with only a few $100s. In another robbery, they got around $150. Then, on October 4th, 1911, McCurdy and his accomplices targeted a train near Okesa, Oklahoma. They believed it was carrying an enormous amount of money. They were wrong. They had stopped the wrong train. Instead of stealing a fortune, they escaped with approximately $46 in cash, along with whiskey and a watch. It was an almost absurd failure, but now law enforcement was looking for McCurdy. 3 days later, a posse tracked him to a friend's ranch near Bartlesville. McCurdy hid inside a hay shed. When the posse surrounded the building, he opened fire. For nearly an hour, gunshots were exchanged. Then a bullet struck McCurdy in the chest. He was 31 years old, and that's where his story should have ended. It didn't. Nobody claimed his body, so the undertaker preserved him, and eventually people began paying to see him. 5 cents. That's all it cost. 5 cents to stand in front of a dead outlaw. The undertaker dressed McCurdy, positioned a rifle in his hands, and displayed his corpse. Some visitors reportedly placed coins directly into his mouth. Think about that. A man had been dead for weeks, and people were lining up to stare at him. But eventually, 2 men arrived, claiming to be McCurdy's brothers. They weren't. They were carnival promoters, and they saw something in McCurdy that nobody else saw. They took his body, and the dead outlaw began traveling, town after town, carnival after carnival, sideshow after sideshow. McCurdy became a spectacle. His identity was sometimes changed. His story was sometimes changed. And the corpse itself became increasingly damaged and deteriorated. But he kept traveling for decades. And this is where the story begins to feel almost like a conspiracy. How could a real human corpse move through the American carnival circuit for decades without anyone discovering what it actually was? How many people looked at him? How many people touched him? How many people stood inches away from a dead man's face and assumed they were looking at a prop? And how many people knew the truth? There are no reliable records proving some secret organization deliberately hid McCurdy's identity. But the circumstances created exactly the kind of mystery that produces conspiracy theories. Traveling carnivals were temporary worlds. People came and went. Shows changed owners. Attractions changed names. Stories were rewritten to make them more profitable. And McCurdy's corpse kept changing hands. Nobody seemed to be asking the most obvious question: who is this dead man? Eventually, his body made its way to California. By the 1970s, McCurdy was hanging inside the Laugh in the Dark Funhouse at the Pike Amusement Zone in Long Beach. By then, almost everyone believed he was a fake, a mannequin, a gruesome decoration, something manufactured to frighten visitors. Then, on December 8th, 1976, a television crew arrived to film an episode of The $6 Million Man. A crew member needed to move one of the hanging figures. He reached for McCurdy's arm and pulled. The arm broke. But what came off wasn't plastic. It wasn't rubber. It wasn't wax. It was human. Real bone. Suddenly, everyone in the room understood something terrifying. They weren't standing next to a prop. They were standing next to a corpse. Police were called. The body was taken to the Los Angeles County Coroner's office. Investigators examined it. The corpse weighed only around 50 pounds. The skin had hardened. The body had deteriorated. Parts of the ears, fingers, and toes were missing. There were traces of old embalming chemicals. There was evidence of the gunshot wound that had killed the man decades earlier. And then investigators found something inside the mouth. A 1924 penny and carnival ticket stubs. Pieces of a forgotten history. Investigators began tracing the corpse through old carnival records and photographs. Eventually, a name emerged: Elmer McCurdy. But they wanted proof. Forensic experts compared the skull with photographs of McCurdy while he was alive. The conclusion was extraordinary. The man hanging inside the funhouse was the outlaw who had died in Oklahoma in 1911. For 65 years, his corpse had been traveling through America, and people had been paying to see it. The story sounds almost too strange to be true. And that's why, even today, it inspires darker speculation. Some people have wondered how many carnival employees actually knew what McCurdy was. Was his identity simply forgotten? Was everyone too afraid to ask questions? Or did some people know exactly what they were displaying and simply choose not to care? There is no evidence proving a secret conspiracy, but there doesn't need to be one to make this story disturbing, because the truth is already horrifying. A dead human being became a carnival attraction. His body was passed from person to person. His identity became part of a sales pitch. And eventually, he was hanging inside a funhouse where people laughed at him. Children walked past him. Visitors stared at him. A television crew filmed beside him. And nobody knew. For decades, nobody knew. Until someone pulled his arm and discovered the bone underneath. In 1977, McCurdy was finally returned to Oklahoma. After 65 years, he was buried at Summit View Cemetery in Guthrie. Around 300 people attended, and this time, authorities made certain nobody would ever take him again. Concrete was poured over the coffin. The carnival was finally over. But imagine what it must have been like to be the person who discovered him. You walk into a funhouse expecting fake monsters, fake corpses, fake screams, fake blood. Then you touch one of the bodies and realize it's real. Suddenly every other figure in the building looks different. You start wondering what else isn't fake, what else has been hanging there, what else has been forgotten. And that's what makes Elmer McCurdy's story so terrifying. Not ghosts, not curses, not supernatural forces, something much more disturbing. A real man died in 1911, and instead of being allowed to disappear into history, his corpse became entertainment. He traveled farther in death than he ever did in life. He was displayed beneath carnival lights, behind glass, inside museums, at amusement parks, and finally, inside a funhouse. For 65 years, people looked directly at a dead man's body, until the day somebody reached out, pulled on the arm, and discovered bone. So the next time you walk into a haunted attraction, and you see something hanging in the darkness, something that looks almost too realistic, don't assume everything is a prop. Because once upon a time, in a California funhouse, it wasn't. It was a real corpse, and his name was Elmer McCurdy.